Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to an FS Club seminar, Unfit for Purpose, What Has Gone Wrong with Our Pension System and How Will We Fix It? And I'm absolutely delighted today to be here with somebody I admire greatly, David Pitt-Watson, author of many things. You can read on the website all the details. As ever with these webinars, we kind of get straight to the subject. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm the Executive Chairman of Zien Group. And it really is my privilege to be able to introduce a number of these webinars, but I can only do that thanks to our sponsors. You see before you the various sponsors who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. Many of them are involved in the provision of pensions, the management of funds related to pensions, and the technology surrounding pensions. So I know that many of them have an interest in the confluence of what we're going to talk about today. The topic of pensions in many ways can be a bit of a depressing one, particularly looked at from a UK perspective. But I think what's going to be exciting today is that David intends to end on some extremely positive notes, which I think might make us all wake up and see that there's potentially a big change of direction ahead of us, and for the better. My job is to get out of your way, and I'll do that in just a moment. David is going to be speaking for about 20 to 25 minutes, giving his thoughts on what Unfit for Purpose and how we will fix it is all about. And we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. As ever, please don't email me questions. I'm here with you on the webinar. Please use the GoToWebinar facility to ask questions, and I'll be feeding those questions, comments, whatever you'd like to point out, into the discussion with David later on. But right now, I think the most important thing, really, David, is to hand over to you. So the floor is yours.
Michael, thank you very much. And I look at this first slide and I wonder where that picture came from. I've both grown a beard, and also I can see that the color of my hair has changed very considerably. So apologies that you're getting a rather older person to talk to you than the one that's featured there. And as Michael said, I want to talk about pensions, and I want to talk positively about them, about new opportunities that I think are opening up. But I also wanted to set it in a context where I'd like to offer a challenge to the way that we think about the world of finance. You know, I think when we think about economic things, when we think about industry, we often assume that more or less the things that were offered in the marketplace will fulfill their purpose, that a car will get us from A to B, that a meal will satisfy our hunger and please our palate, and that competitive forces will make that happen. Why? Because we want a better car that's got lower gas mileage, that travels faster and more allows us to travel more comfortably, and that customers that don't meet consumer needs, that don't fulfill a purpose, will fall by the wayside. My starting point in thinking about finance is that assumption that markets and competition will get you there, that is a dangerous assumption. That there isn't a reliable link between what is offered in the finance industry and the finance industry fulfilling its purpose. Markets and competition are still, of course, very important. And boy, is the finance industry important. I mean, we are simply not going to be able to solve the big problems of the world, whether they're about economic development or inequality or climate or development or looking after people in old age. We simply aren't going to solve those problems unless we have an effective finance industry. Name me a rich country and it will have a sophisticated finance industry. Name me a poor one and it won't have a sophisticated finance industry. Indeed, so fundamental is finance that many of the pioneers in finance are not a sort of investment bankery sorts. They're social entrepreneurs. The only business person to have won the Nobel Peace Prize in my lifetime is a financier, Mohammed Yunus. He set up a bank that has taken hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. And just going to the first slide as well, Michael, if you could. The finance industry is huge. This looks at the scale of the finance industry as a proportion of the GDP in the United States over the last 100 and something years. As you can see, it's grown from about 2% of the GDP to nearly 8% of the GDP. The similar statistics would be true in this country and indeed in most countries in the world. And furthermore, the number of assets that the finance industry has handled, taking it from outside the finance industry and then reinvesting it outside the finance industry, has also increased from about 1 times the GDP to about 4 times the GDP. Now, maybe if we can go to the next slide, Michael, if that's true, it ought to be the case that over time, given new technologies, given competition, given markets, that the finance industry could demonstrate that it was doing its job better. And if its job is to take money from point A where it is and reinvest it in point B where it is, the cost of doing that should surely have fallen over the past 120 years. After all, there's been lots and lots of technology that has been applied to the finance industry since the 1880s. But in fact, if you take those two graphs, the ones of the proportion of GDP consumed by the finance industry and the number of assets invested, and you divide one by the other, what you discover is that it's cost about the same amount for the finance industry to perform its intermediation function in 1880 as it does today. You can adjust that for different services that it's being able to provide, but the sort of dramatic increases in productivity that you would expect, they're just not there. And that, it seems to me, is quite a challenge. And it's reflected in comments that people make about the finance industry. You remember Adair Turner saying lots of what we do is not socially useful. Paul Volcker, that all that's happening is with innovation is that we're passing the rents around. There's nothing valuable that's being given. And indeed, that's reflected, I think, in the public's view of the finance industry. This graph here just shows the answer to a focus group question in a study by the Bank of England that said, find me one word to describe the finance industry. And as you can see, these are the words in this word map scaled for how often they occurred. And the number one word was corrupt. I don't for a minute believe that the finance industry is corrupt, but you can see how people might feel that an industry that's grown from 2% to 8% of the GDP, where there's no obvious increase in its productivity, and where its regulators are saying that all it's doing is passing the rents around, is one where people might consider that it's corrupt, manipulated, volatile, complex, those sorts of things. So that's kind of the background. And all I would say from this is, look, we've had lots of markets and lots of competition in the finance industry. We can't demonstrate that they alone have managed to bring it to a successful outcome. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about pensions, and I'll come back to the finance industry. Pensions, of course, are an absolutely vital service for people to look after themselves in their old age. And indeed, so vital a service that, again, remember I said if you scratch back through the history of the finance industry, often it's social reformers that you discover who are the innovators, like Muhammad Yunus. Actually, the first pension, a pension that paid you an income from when it was needed until the day you died, the first pension designed in that way was designed by two Scottish ministers. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I was born in Scotland, and I know that the Scots do have a tendency to boast that everything that was worthwhile that was ever invented was invented in Scotland. But I can assure you it is true that the first properly funded pension that lasted till the day you died was invented by two guys, ministers of the Church of Scotland, called Wallace and Webster. By the way, this is a sketch of Webster preaching to a crowd of people who clearly have not heard about social distancing. And pensions are critically important. They also are absolutely an essential input to the finance industry. If we could just go to the next slide, Michael, this is something I think people don't often understand. If you look at the wealth of British people, I think it's about 13 trillion according to the Office of National Statistics. It splits about 50-50 into property wealth and financial wealth. So the red and pink are the financial wealth, and the grey and black in this are property wealth. So about 40% of total wealth and about 2/3 or more of financial wealth in the UK is a pension promise. So this is absolutely huge in terms of the amount of money that is saved. To give you a sense, pension wealth in the UK, funded pension wealth indeed, is about 4 times larger than the total assets of the 1,000 wealthiest families, as found in the Sunday Times Rich List. So the money that is going into the financial system is typically pensions, and it's going in huge scale. Now, the purpose of a pension, as I said, is to provide an income from you, typically from the time you retire until the time you die. And here's something I find absolutely challenging, which is that if you look at people, young people particularly in the private sector today, and they ask you, how is it that I save for an income that will last from retirement until the time that I die, I can't tell them the answer to that. I can tell them how they save so that they're given a check on the day they retire. That's what we call DC pensions. But that's not an income that's going to last until the day you die. 40 years ago, when I was employed, I remember being signed on for my first pension. And I remember being told, look, this will give you that income from the day you die. It'll probably be 2/3 of the income that you earned in your last year working for us. But there is absolutely no promise associated with that. But that's what it aims to do. But today's pensions provide a saving system, but they don't provide a retirement income. And I think it's worth just going through history and thinking, how did we manage to get there? We've got the most sophisticated financial system in the world. It should, if markets and competition are working, and gosh, there's lots of markets and competition in the services for pensions, it should be something that is fulfilling its purpose ever better. Now, I don't want to pretend that there was a golden age 40 years ago. There were lots of things that were wrong with what was in those days called, what was in those days the old pension system, what today we call DB, defined benefit pensions. But it is worth just going through the history of how those DB pensions came to fail. Because it wasn't because anybody wanted to do anything wrong. It was because they didn't think about the purpose in the first place. So as we go through, the 70s was when I had my first job, the 80s, all the pension funds thought that they had more than enough money to be able to provide for people in the retirement. And they therefore asked, might it be possible to take a holiday in paying into the pension fund? And employees agreed to that. And so pensions holidays were taken, but the agreement was made only on the basis that the money promised was a firm promise, a defined benefit. Then the government came in with another set of legislation that said all pension funds should clearly have a defined benefit. They're well funded, we'll give them a defined benefit. Well, that was all very well. But of course, the world changes over the lifetime of a pension. A pension lasts decades and decades, and levels of return went down, levels of longevity went up higher than was anticipated in the 70s and 80s. And pension funds discovered that they were beginning to be underfunded. So first of all, they went to this savings system, the DC system, where new employees would save, and then they would be forced to buy an annuity, which is a pension that lasts until the day that they die. And then they stopped paying into the DB system for all employees, and they went into the DC system. But there was a fatal flaw with the DC system, which was that annuities became ever more expensive. And thus it was that about 5 years ago, the government introduced pensions freedoms, which said, look, if you're saving for a pension, you may not want to buy an annuity. You may not want to buy a pension with it. You can do what you will with it because annuities are so expensive. And so we discover ourselves with a saving system, actually in many ways a very good saving system with auto-enrollment and all the rest of it, but without a proper system for the payment of pension. And that seems to me to be an excellent example of how it is that the finance industry can, over time, lose its sense of what its purpose is. But there is hope on the horizon here, I think. I've been involved in this now for about 10 years. It started I started working with the Royal Society of Arts, the RSA, with a commission which I led that John Banham chaired. Actually, if we go back to the previous slide, Michael, that would be good. I mean, it started with focus groups asking people, what do you want from the pension system? And they all came back and said, look, I'd like an income that lasts from the time I retire until the time that I die. And we noted that that was still available in some countries, in Denmark, in Holland, in Canada, but wasn't available any longer in the UK, and started working with lawyers and actuaries and with experts about how is it that you would structure this. And then we started to involve the policymakers, and I'm very pleased to say that by 2015, there was a new pensions bill that should have made all of this possible. The new pensions bill then proved to be too complicated to be able to implement. But then 3 years ago, Royal Mail said, look, we really do not want to close down our DB pension plan and replace it with something that is giving people a check rather than giving people an income. The government, through the 2015 Act, has already demonstrated with full cross-party support that they want to bring back a more flexible system that will work. Please, can you pass the legislation that would allow that to happen? And I'm very pleased to say that as we speak, the legislation has just passed from the House of Lords to the House of Commons, and I would be hopeful that it will be passed through the House of Commons before Christmas, which will allow, again, what we had in the 1970s, which is a promise that doesn't need to be such a hard promise and can flex itself on the basis of best efforts. And I know that, Michael, you've done presentations about collective DC pensions before, but these really are quite a breakthrough. I mean, to give you a sense, a CDC pension on average would have paid about 30 or 40% more than DC plus annuity over the past 60 or 70 years. And if we think about this as being 40% of the assets of maybe 2/3 of the financial assets of British households, to make them 30 or 40% more productive is quite extraordinary. But by the way, some people ask me if we can go to the next slide now, Michael, how can that 30 or 40% possibly be correct? Well, the reason is because the charge on a pension or the investment return on a pension is made every year on the capital sum. So if you imagine that you had a pension that was had the highest possible investment return and the lowest possible charge is 0%, you could have 100% of the money would come back to you. If it had a 1% charge, only 73% of the money would come back to you. A 2% charge, only 53% of the money would come back to you, and a 3% charge, 37% of the money would come back to you. So this makes a huge difference. By the way, is that graph that we showed at the beginning of the productivity of the finance industry, if it had gone from 2% to 0.5%, a reasonable productivity increase over 100%, we could see pensions would be much better simply as a result of that. So just going to the final slide then, Michael, and then we can sort of throw this open to some questions. So on pensions, we have a new pensions bill. It offers enormous advantages. As I say, if 40% of our savings can be 30% more efficient, then over time the capital value of that is simply enormous. Easily £1 trillion. And I think given that the legislation is being passed, for those of you that are interested in the whole pensions area, this is a big deal. And we need to think about how we can take advantage of it. By the way, we also need to ask ourselves, how is it that we avoid the pitfalls of this going forward? Because, you know, there are pitfalls have been discovered in Denmark, Holland, and Canada, where you have a collective DC system. How do we make sure that we avoid the pitfalls? And how also do we make sure that market forces and competition are encouraging ever better design and not encouraging us into areas where there might be pitfalls? And people might want to ask questions about that. But the larger thing, of which I think pensions is an illustration, is just simply my contention that financial systems won't become purposeful by market magic alone. You need the right institutions. I think if you think about the financial system as being like an ecosystem of institutions, of people, of cultures, of markets, of competition, of regulation, that's a more helpful way of thinking about it than simply saying all we need to do is to have lots of competitors and everybody to be provided with 24 pages of terms and conditions on their credit card. You need to design systems that are going to be fit for purpose. And what we did was we took a pension system that actually in many ways was better. It wasn't a golden age, but that was many ways was more fit for purpose. And we have turned it into something that is struggling to do its job. The pensions bill hopefully begins a process where we can make the pension system more fit for purpose. By the way, this has, I think, quite big implications for people that are involved in financial technology, fintech generally. In general, we think when we get new technology, that actually what will happen is things will become more efficient, that the benefits of the technology will be passed on to the consumer. I'm not sure that that is the case in finance. If it had been the case, it's very difficult to see how the finance system today is not vastly more efficient in its job of intermediation than it was 120 years ago. And yet, as you've seen from the graph, it's difficult to demonstrate that that's the case. So some technologies, I think, can be marvelously productive. If you think in Kenya, M-Pesa, which created a payment system for people using mobile telephony, absolutely fantastic. Turned a country like Kenya, which had almost nobody banked, into one where a huge proportion of the population now do have banking services and are wealthier and more productive and better off as a result. But I can also think of a technology that seems to have done stuff that I simply can't understand what its benefit is. I always struggle, for example, with high frequency trading. I'm sure someone will want to argue with me about that, but there is technological development that seems to me to be not terribly purposeful. And therefore, I think there are some broader questions that we might be asking ourselves. So what is the purpose of the financial system and its various institutions? It's not something that is typically asked or answered by politicians, by regulators, or indeed by participants in the financial system. It would be enormously helpful, I think, if it was, and if that was up for debate and up for criticism. if you know what the institution's purpose is, you can then go back and think about, well, how well does that institution serve its purpose? For example, I commissioned a piece of work about stock exchanges, which started with the hypothesis that the reason that we set up stock exchanges was not for short-term reasons, but for long-term reasons, that companies could raise equity on a stock exchange, which would be permanent capital. But because the owners of the equity could trade that capital, it meant they were willing to invest because they could get some of their money back, albeit at an unknown price at some time in the future. If you look at stock exchanges today, we have less companies quoted on stock exchanges, despite the fact that we have 20, 50 times more trading going on. We really ought to be asking ourselves the question of, is this really what we want stock exchanges to be doing? And how can technology help, and how can it hinder as we think about a better financial system? I think this is a pretty fundamental question that I'm asking. I'm a finance practitioner myself, but I teach at Cambridge, actually a course called The Purpose of Finance. Some of the slides from it you'll see here. I think the whole way that we research the finance industry, the way that we teach about finance, the way we regulate it, the way we practice it, is one that has just simply become uncoupled from questions about what was its purpose in the first place. And so hopefully the pensions example gives actually a really important example of something that is moving, I hope, towards greater purpose. But this larger question of purpose for the industry as a whole, or from the institutions within it, it's absolutely fundamental, I think. It's also one that is very, very, very challenging. So I don't think in the next 24 hours, and certainly not in the next half hour, we're going to answer all of those questions, but I hope we can have an interesting debate, Michael. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, David. That was a heck of a tour de force. We've got quite a few questions and comments here. I'll just start with one fast one. Mike Clark was curious if you might just do a quick name check on your thoughts on the Great Risk Transfer Program from the Institute of Actuaries.
The Great
Risk Transfer.
Yeah. Well, because risk is transferred within pensions from the employer to the employee entirely, yeah. Yeah, including longevity risk, including timing risk, including every risk. And actually what a CDC pension does is it says, look, we should share longevity risk. That's its principal advantage.
Now, a couple of people out in the audience would just like, could you articulate in sort of 30 seconds, what is the big thing in the new pensions bill that makes you so optimistic?
Yeah, so a CDC pension is designed to provide an income from the time you retire until the time you die. If you design a pension that way, you pool longevity risk and you invest broadly the same way as you would historically have invested a DB pension. If you do those two things, you over time get a much better return at a much lower cost than you will if you save individually and then have to buy an annuity. So it allows a pooling of risk and therefore a greater return.
Alex Adamu is curious about your view on death benefits. Now, DC, I'm not sure if that applies to collective defined contribution, but DC schemes typically provide a death benefit which runs counter to the purpose of providing an income until death. Scrapping the death benefits of expired members would release funds to increase the retirement incomes of unexpired members of a scheme. Current arrangements seem to conflate two fundamentally different products, pensions and life insurance. Your thoughts?
A great question, and it almost answers itself. That's right. If you save in a DC pension, you take your so you've got your DC pension and you're using drawdown and you fall under a bus the next day. It's great for the people that are going to inherit through your will. But if you live on until you're 105, unfortunately, you're starving because you've run out of money. So you're right. The DC does some other stuff that is not a pension.
Good.
If you want an effective pension, it's best to have a structure that provides a pension, and that's what CDC does. And it's actually what DB does that as well. Annuities do it as well, but they do it with different levels of promises.
It's been a bit of the problem for 2 decades, is keep calling what is effectively a savings scheme a pension. Yeah. Jeremy Light is curious. Surely pension trustees are failing in their duties if they oversee a scheme with up to 3% annual costs. And he would also like to know, what is the average annual cost of investments under a DC pension scheme, if you happen to know it offhand?
So, really interesting question. The answer is that we don't know the answer. And indeed, I did a study for the FCA about 5 years ago. By the way, if you're interested in the pension stuff, the RSA website has got a lot of the studies that we've done. But this was one that was about costs. And of course, so some of the costs are what it is you're directly charged. And if you're with a big employer, it's probably quite low. Or if you're with a small employer on your own, it might be quite significant. What you're not told about, though, is all the hidden costs, the cost of trading, for example, the custodial costs, and so on and so forth. So there are pensions that are charging a 2 and 3% in the private arena. There's lots of drawdowns that are charging 2 and 3% in the private arena. We have been campaigning on this almost for as long as we've been campaigning on CDC, and indeed got a referral to the Office of Fair Trading, now it's the CMA. They instituted, as you may know, these independent governance committees that are supposed to look after the costs. They have brought down to a maximum charge of unhidden costs of about 1%, which probably means that there are hidden costs on a 1% of another 0.5% or 1%. So there's still 1.5% and 2% that are out there. But look, lots of trustees don't know what the charges are. That in itself has been quite a big campaign.
Joanna Hicks shares with us, I gave up with the pension system a while back. As a consumer, most of my savings were directed to PEPs and ISAs. Taxed as the money goes in, while pensions are taxed on the way out. Have you factored in the different ways people have of effectively providing, for their retirement, as opposed to just a focus on pensions?
Yeah, look, and if you're just saving money, an ISA is a good way of doing it, and a DC pension can be a good way of doing it. Typically, the DC pension, your employer, unless you're self-employed, the employer will put in some money as well. So it is a particularly good deal if you do it that way. But if you're thinking about specifically a pension, and that what you want is an income from the time you retire till the time you die, and you don't know whether you're going to live for another 1 year after you retire or another 40 years after you retire, you do need some way of thinking about how you share that risk. We all know on average we'll live for about 20, 21, 22, 19, 18 years. So you can share that risk with others. And if you do that, then that makes it, you don't need to save such a vast amount of money in case you live for such a long time. So a pension does do something that is very specific in terms of looking after you in old age. And what it does is it lasts until the day you die. A drawdown isn't strictly speaking a pension, although it's being used to give you an income in old age.
Mike Clark has kind of lit up the board, and I'm going to string together two comments he made because I think they make sense together. He agrees with you, for example, regarding the elements of fintech, but it leads him to suggest the purpose of finance includes different pieces of risk management decisions being taken in the best place: governments, regulators, companies, asset owners, investment managers, consumers, citizens. So fair point there. But he then goes on, and I think quite intriguingly to me anyway, he's looking here, while we citizens view risk through effectively kind of our quality of life, he says sustainable development goal lens, do we need asset owners to do strategic risk management, before the strategic asset allocation? Really this, modern portfolio theory has a narrow view of this big risk beta, while we citizens, view it as how it hits us personally. I can see a lot of tar pits in there, but the general suggestion seems to make some sense.
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, I might just take a couple of minutes to answer this one, Michael, because it's a big question, and there may be other questions on this as well. And indeed, it is. My background is as activist investor, particularly on responsible investing and ESG and all of those sorts of things. And I got involved in pensions because those focus groups said, it's all very well you talking about that, but if I can't get an income until the day I die, I don't want to talk about ESG investing. But let's come back to the ESG investing. Modern portfolio theory, which is what it is that you will be taught as an investor, is extremely narrow in the way that it sees the world. It simply says there are a set of assets that you can invest in, and if you know a lot about the performance of those assets, you can maximize the risk-return trade-off for different people. It doesn't suggest that as an investor you have any influence on the world at all. Whereas, in fact, if we go and we look at our economics class, or we go and look at company law, we know that companies are run for the shareholders, for the investors. And it's always seemed to me to be utterly bizarre that you could be so blinkered using modern portfolio theory, where as a shareholder in particular, but also as a bondholder, but particularly as a shareholder, you have such profound influence over how it is that money is made and how it is that the economy works. And it does have to be bonkers if you are managing pension fund money on behalf of the 30 million people in Britain who have a pension of one sort or another, and you're making money for them by encouraging companies to invest in a way that is destroying the environment or the society in which they hope to prosper both today and in the future. Absolutely bonkers that you're not doing something about that. And it's particularly bonkers because all the evidence suggests that if you're a good owner of a company, it will make more money, and therefore not only will this person be better off in terms of the society they live in, they'll also be better off financially. And I think in the last 20 years we have made some progress in getting that debate heard. But whoever asked the question will know, if you take an investment class, it will start with modern portfolio theory, not with that much wider. And it seems to me absolutely self-evidently a clear position that I tried to articulate in the last couple of minutes. So I hope that answers the question. A bit of a long answer.
Yeah, so I'd like to touch on two areas before we have to close. One, number of comments picking up on your points about the state of the financial system. John Spain makes a good point about, don't get too confused that sophistication may equal complexity. So the financial system may well be sophisticated, but DB funding system is hopeless, dependent upon a poorly regulated regulatory system, dependent upon a stupid criterion, discounting. Alice Chappell goes on, I'm still not sure why the market has not come up with this lower cost solution, unless the financial institutions involved simply cannot deliver at this lower cost, or is there an oligopoly? How can the cost come down? And then she wonders if we need more regulation and intervention. So your thoughts on both of those?
Okay, so the first one on DB and complexity. Look, I would agree with that, and I would agree generally that we have a pension system that's become ever more complex, and not ever more better. Let me give you a statistic that might interest you. I've been involved in pensions and investments since about 1990. I actually started my career in industry and then moved across to finance. And in 1990, there were 3,000 pages of regulation that applied to pensions, both legislation through Parliament and regulation. At the last count, there were 165,000 pages. So we've gone from 3 to 165,000 pages in one career span, not even a full career span. 3,000 pages, it was possible for one person to get their head around. 165,000 pages, it's simply not possible for people to get their head around. And actually, what we're trying to do is reasonably simple. I'd like to set my money aside. I want to retire probably sometime in my 60s, and I want the money to be able to give me an income, which give me a rough estimate of what it is that it's going to be, but it lasts until the day we die. I mean, we ought to be able to do that. And actually what we do is regulators are playing whack-a-mole with a system that hasn't been designed to be fit for purpose in the first place. So we have a system, something goes wrong, whack, we pass a regulation. Something else goes wrong, whack, we pass another regulation. So we started with 3,000 pages, we finished with 165,000 pages. And if whoever was asking that question was saying, would it be a really good idea to, think about some commission that could just flush out all the stuff that we don't need, be clear to people about what it is that each financial product would give them, have proper governance of those things, proper transparency, and so on and so forth. I absolutely, completely agree with that.
Okay.
Then Alice's question, it's a lovely question, and it's exactly the question I asked myself when I read the Philippon study, you know, the one where there's no increase in productivity. This can't be the case. I've been working on this for 30 years. I've been really competitive. We've been investing. We've been trying to do what we thought customers wanted, and yet the cost is not going down. So I think that first of all, there may be some things that are wrong with Philippon's study, but even if you think all of the things that can be wrong are wrong, you still don't get the productivity increase that you would expect. So what could be going on here? I think two things. So one is that for markets and competition to work, you need to have symmetric information between the buyer and the seller. So the person that's selling you stuff can't sell you something that isn't really to your advantage, because you know what's to your advantage. And where that isn't the case, we have special mechanisms for making sure that people don't abuse it. Medicine would be a very good example. I go to the doctor, I have no idea what's wrong with me. I'm asked a few questions and they say, look, you should take these tablets, or you should, usually for me, you need to take exercise or do something like that. That you should do these things. I have to be able to trust the doctor that's how it is that things will work, and the doctor needs to have an ethic and be paid in the right way so that they can perform that absolute fiduciary duty to me and always be in my shoes. And as we know, that sometimes goes wrong in medicine. I think our failure to recognize that in finance meant it's gone much more wrong. The second thing is, I think there are lots of things in finance that look a little bit like an arms race, where what we're doing is we're competing with each other rather than trying to serve the consumer. High frequency trading, for example, is one where whoever gets their computer closest to the stock exchange seems to be able to make a whole load of money over somebody whose computer is further away from the stock exchange, because of the nanoseconds difference in the time that it takes them to be able to trade. And then they pay a big lot of money to the stock exchange in order to be able to do this. Similarly, fund managers competing against each other. We all know that 90% of our pension is going to be paid from alpha, not from beta, but we spend 90% of, or more than 90% of the money in fund management trying to generate alpha rather than trying to think about beta. So there are structural things within the industry that I think do allow this to happen, and it's not helped by a regulator who plays whack-a-mole on it. Where it might be helped would be if we just had a new debate that was to say, look, what's the purpose of a pension? What's the purpose of a fund manager? What's the purpose of a stock exchange, a bank, and so on and so forth? And there, I think you might design something that could be dramatically more efficient, with huge knock-on benefits, economic, social, and so on, to the people who depend on the finance industry.
I couldn't agree with you more about there's a whole area of, it's good competition and bad competition, high frequency trading in particular. You're right, it is an arms race. I've often used the example, it's like a guy goes, buys a new automobile, and it doesn't get back up to the top of the hill the way his old banger did. He goes to the shop, and the guy at the shop says, yeah, but look inside the engine. It does 1,000,000 RPM. Yep, it doesn't get to the top of the hill. But who's ever seen somebody do 1,000,000 RPM? And we see this in the studies, which say, look at the efficiency gains. Look how much cheaper a trade is. But the question is, why am I having to make so many trades? Oh, because you get whacked if you went straight out. And we've got just a couple more times, just a few, if I might. I just want to close as well. In fact, I'll read this as a bit of a comment. Angel Gaviero says, yeah, not only financial intermediation costs has not improved in 100 years, but systemic risk has increased. In fact, the asset size is sort of artificially larger. We keep driving people into liquid asset areas for this. So in the last 10 years, based on QE, we've seen this huge rise in volume, and then it dropped in 30% in 2 weeks before central banks intervened. We've got all the derivatives offshore, and a lot of this stuff didn't exist before the 70s. So there's another assumption, not just about market competition, but also about your pension is best done in traded liquid markets.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm not entirely sure what the evidence would be in systematic risk. I also, it seems to me that there's even the idiosyncratic risk. Pensions would be a good example. I mean, I can reduce the idiosyncratic risk on longevity and on timing if I invest collectively, but our regulation has said that I can't do that until this new pensions law is passed. And we need to be thinking about the risk return trade-off, but from 30,000 feet, as Angel is doing. And it is quite bizarre that we have not reduced systemic risk. As gosh, how many Nobel Prizes in economics are supposed to have been won because people have analyzed the finance market, and yet we're not managing to apply that, or maybe it's wrong.
Last question then is, you mentioned collective defined contribution in Denmark, Holland, and Canada, and you suggested that we needed to learn from their mistakes. Have there been mistakes that we should be aware of?
Yes, really, there have been. Look, there isn't a perfect pension system. A British and a Dutch person saving the same amount for their retirement, and the British person buying an annuity, the Dutch person will get a 30–40% higher pension. But for example, one of the things in a CDC pension is that in the event that you hit a crisis, an investment crisis, you need to reduce the pension in payment because you can't afford it. So when the financial crisis hit, on average, Dutch pensions were reduced by about 2%. I think it was 1.9%, which doesn't seem extraordinary if you started off with a 30% higher pension. That now it's only 28% higher, but it was a 2% reduction. And in some pension funds, it was more than that, Michael. It was as much as 6%, 2% every year for 3 years. But we had just had a financial crisis. People's incomes were not raising, so on and so forth. That was probably fair. But the mechanisms by which that was done was really awkward. I mean, first of all, because this had never happened before. And people had thought that they had DB pensions. They didn't. They had CDC pensions. And so the communication needs to be good. And also there were, I think, a number of things that I think were over-regulation in the Dutch system, where you had to spend at least 12 months seeing if you could find another way out of your deficit bind. And therefore, all the young people got absolutely pissed off that the old people were still taking their pension when it was unaffordable from that pot for the 12 months. And then the old people were happy for the 12 months, and then they had their pensions reduced by 2%, and then they all felt unhappy. So all of that communication stuff is really, really, really important and significant. I think there are other things in the detail. These are going to be hugely important in the UK. We do not want 40,000 CDC schemes like we've got 40,000 DB schemes. We want a few really big, competitive, efficient, low-cost, trustee, overseen systems to be able to make this work. If we don't do that, then we will fritter away all the benefits of the better structure on a sort of poor competitive environment and those sorts of things. So there are lots and lots and lots of lessons to be learned. The passage of the primary legislation through Parliament is very much the beginning of what it is that we can do, rather than the end of what we can do. But the collectivization of pensions, if you've thought about it, it simply makes sense for me to be saving with a bunch of other people. We don't know how long we're going to live. But if I die first, you can have my money and it'll last you until you're 105. If you die first, we'll have a pot of money that will serve me if I live until I'm 105. It's just an efficient way of doing it. And that legislation should be passed so that we can start doing things with that, starting from Christmas time.
Well, David, sadly, I'm getting a lot of thanks, which is always a sign that we've come to the end of time. Joanna Hicks says CDC is the way forward, Curly, but too late for me, sadly.
That's lovely, Michael.
What's interesting is that CDC tackles something that's always been on my mind, which is has been the failure of pensions, has been to recognize that longevity risk is the biggest thing. That's what actually was there to handle. And this idea of a defined retirement date was the problem. So I was always into picking a date from which you get an annuity. So you decide to retire rather than having fixed retirement ages. Mike Clark talks about how about buying a call option paid for out of your DC pot at retirement. on a deferred annuity commencing at, say, age 82, or an age that could be set based on longevity of that cohort.
You can do all of those things, and if you do that, you will reduce the 30% to 25%.
Yeah, and so I think there's a lot to play for, but you're clearly very positive, and it's nice to see that positivity coming forth about this pension bill, and we have a chance to make a much better start. If you might, I've got to give a few rounds of thanks if I could. The first is to our sponsors. What a wide-ranging and long-term subject, pensions. You know, it's a topic where it's the financial services sector trying to produce a product that's really got to last about 125 years. And I remember once when I was railing about this, the German ambassador at the time took me to one side and pointed out that our Anglo-Saxon models weren't perhaps so good, because his father had fought in World War I, had seen the Weimar, had seen the destruction of Germany in World War II, and when he retired, he still got a pension, which was the social contract was more important perhaps than the financial devices or mechanisms used to achieve it. And I hope CDC can embed some of that as well. So to our sponsors, to our audience, some superb questions today. We've got 2 more webinars this week. Tomorrow, if you've got any interest whatsoever in the other bit of the long term, which is the environment, we have Kirsten Dunlop dialing in from Amsterdam. Kirsten's the CEO of Climate Kick, which is the great European innovation unit for climate change, with an enormous influence over all the budgets and technologies that are going. And we'll have another interesting look at the long term, and this is about future public risk. We have Julian Enowizi joining us on Thursday, really talking about his ideas, which he was working on for many years. I'll vouch for that, trying to design a public-private vehicle to handle systemic risk, Resilience Re, as it's called. But David, I was delighted that you would do it. David's book is fantastic. We've got questions here asking if you could suggest some reading material, which if you do, we'll post on the site for those when they're notified that the webinar's been posted.
For folk that are interested in the overall argument, and it's got half a chapter on pensions, the book I wrote with Stephen Davis and John LeCumnick, it's called What They Do With Your Money. Yeah. And it aims to be readable. If you're allowed to travel, fly the Atlantic or travel to Glasgow, you can pick it up, and it's got summaries at the end of each chapter. If you're really,
I have read it, and I will vouch for that being very good.
If you're into the stuff about CDC, if you just Google my name and the Royal Society of Arts, and you'll see there's a whole series of publications, of which a good start would be the briefing, the parliamentary briefing that we have recently put out. But if you go back through that, there's stuff on there, and there's stuff about costs there as well you might be interested in.
And we'll get those posted on the site. I think the book already is, but we'll post the RSA materials.
That's terrific, Mike.
So, David, you made a very compelling case, one that certainly we would agree with, that starting with what's the purpose is the most important thing. The purpose of the pension is to provide that retirement income, and let's focus on that. I think that was very, very compelling. Delighted that you're optimistic about the future, especially in these days when people do seem to get in a bit of a gloom. But I'm afraid, unfortunately, one of the things I can't do at the moment is to open up and give you the applause that the audience wants. But I have my little Buddhist karmic clapper here, and I'd like to say thank you. And very sadly, have to draw this to a conclusion. So goodbye, one and all.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.